People, historical people, just like us, do not know what's going to happen on Tuesday.
Right.
And they didn't know how the war was going to be fought. They didn't know if they were going to win. Um, and they were all flawed, just the way we're flawed.
Yeah.
And if you believe they're without flaw and we are horribly flawed in some way, then we can't ever do anything. But they were full of weaknesses and did terrible things, some of them. But they also did great things. And I just think it's important to understand the reality of history and biography, because otherwise it makes you feel powerless.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special edition of GBH's Beyond the Page, celebrating America's 250th anniversary with Geoffrey C. Ward. I'm Craig LeMoult from GBH Newsroom. I am so excited to welcome our guest this evening. Geoffrey C. Ward is a historian, he's an author, he's a screenwriter. He's the author of 19 books, including A First-Class Temperament, The Emergence of Franklin Roosevelt, which won the National Critics Circle Award, the Francis Parkman Prize, and it was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He's written or co-written many documentary films, which I know you've seen. They include The War, The Civil War, Baseball, The West, Mark Twain, Not Ourselves Alone, and the jazz documentary as well. He wrote that one. Most recently, of course, he co-authored both the film script and this amazing companion book, The American Revolution, with Ken Burns. And we just can't wait to hear about it tonight. Geoffrey C. Ward, welcome and thank you so much for joining us for Beyond the Page. Just reading this book and watching this documentary, I feel like we're so used to hearing about history of the American Revolution in particular. It's just the story of the founding fathers, right? These larger than life figures. But what I love about your writing, both in the book and in the documentary, is the people in it are so relatable. I mean, both these major historical figures, but also these lesser known characters that you introduce us to. Can you just start out by talking about your approach to writing about history in that way?
Well, sure. Look, first, it's just great to be here. I'm an old GBH hand, because I wrote a lot of shows there before I started working with Ken. Um, we sort of started years ago finding that these stories work best if you if if the viewer realizes that there are a lot of people precisely like them
Right.
who happen to be living 150 years ago or 250 years ago, and that pretending that those people were different, it makes for a false sense of the past. Um, and I love all those small, I say small, they're terribly important characters that we managed to follow through all of these shows, but certainly during the Revolution. Just 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 the way the grunts that we write about slog their way through this unbelievable struggle.
Yeah.
You sort of can't believe they did it, and they did.
Yeah, I mean, one of those people was John Greenwood, and I
Yeah,
had never heard of John Greenwood before. But his
I
story,
I
which
hadn't either.
it's a remark. Can you just sort of, for those who maybe haven't seen this, give us a quick summary of like this ridiculous story of this one person and their path through the revolution?
Sure. He's a Boston kid. He lived in the North End. He was sent away to be an apprentice to his uncle in what Falmouth, which was became Portland, Maine. And when he was there, he heard there was a war starting, and he got very scared because he thought he's just a kid. He's 14, I think, and he worries that the British are going to kill his parents, so he has to go back. His uncle won't let him go, so he walks all the way from Portland, Maine to Boston. By that time, Boston is surrounded and they won't let him into the city. So he joins, and he likes to play the fife. So he joins a militia unit, a Massachusetts militia unit, fights through all the way, all the battles until he gets to Trenton. that's a great victory for George Washington. And by then he's had enough. And so when Washington makes an emotional appeal for his soldiers whose term is about to be up, he's not one of the brave ones that stays with Washington. He goes home. He's fumigated by his father because he's covered lice and stuff from living in the woods all this time. And he gets bored at home. So he becomes a privateer, which is these are ships that went out to raid British shipping. He was on, I think it's five of them, and I think he was imprisoned three different times or four different times in the Caribbean. He then Now that's all we can do in the film. In the book, we continue with him. He comes back. The war ends. He fails at three different things.
Mm-hmm.
He becomes a dentist, and he ends up becoming New York's most prominent dentist and George Washington's dentist. And 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 the general gave him formally as a gift his last tooth, which Greenwood pulled, and which he kept in a watch fob. And if you in the book, there's a picture of the watch
There's
fob.
a picture.
Does
There's a
it still
picture of
exist?
this thing with
And I
Washington.
tell you, when I found him, I was just ecstatic. I just thought he was, yeah, he's too good for a movie. He's
Yeah.
just fantastic.
Yeah, you wouldn't believe actually all of the
Right.
different places, and just the fact that he ends up as the Washington's dentist at the end of the
I
story
know. You
is
just can't
just,
believe it.
yeah, no, it's kind of, and there's lots of stories like that of these. I mean, and one of the reasons we know about his story and so many of the stories throughout is because he wrote these remarkable letters, right? You're quoting
He
from,
wrote an actual memoir of
okay.
himself, which he meant for his sons, which eventually got published very obscurely. And we were lucky enough to run across it and say, boy, this guy's going in. I remember the day
Yeah.
I told Ken, have I got a character for you?
Well, I mean, I wanted to ask about how you find these people in the research. I mean, like you do, is there a team of people who are digging this up? Are you just,
No,
going through
no.
archives? Like, how does this all happen?
Well, there's a big team. This is a
Yeah.
collaborative, as anybody in TV knows, it's a collaborative art. Um, but initially, I actually don't know how to direct somebody in research. I've done a lot of a lot of things, and however bright somebody was, I would not trust them to find the thing that only I know I need. And that's a stupid attitude. I wish I had not come to that conclusion. So I read and read and read until I can't stand it anymore. And then I start writing. But I keep reading and amassing stuff all the way when we're through. If you see behind me, there are a few books, and that's just a very small number of the books. We're doing Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society next. And
Awesome.
so I'm surrounded by books about Lyndon Johnson at the moment. And I'm trying to learn enough to write.
One thing I was thinking about when reading this book and watching the documentaries is that so often, too often, the retelling of American history, as I said, has been reduced to sort of these stories of just these white men in power.
Mhm.
But you delve into the experiences of some of the more marginalized groups whose stories are so important to understanding the full history of what's happened. We had some questions. Denise from Somerville, South Carolina, and Sarah from Boston both asked about the role that African Americans and Native Americans play in the fight for American independence. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, we have both. I want to say one thing about that thing. History is by its nature inclusive. You don't have to check boxes. If you just look at it, you realize everybody's involved in these things. And uh, about a third of the non-Indian population of the colonies was Black, mostly enslaved people. And they are faced with a very odd choice, which is whether they should sympathize and, if possibly, side with the rebellion or with the British. And because the British offered them a sort of quasi freedom, That is, you were free if you could get away from your rebel master and join the British, they would free you at the end of the war. Um, they did nothing for enslaved people whose enslavers were Tories. I mean, this was not abolitionism at all. And so tens of thousands of slaves managed to run away and join the British forces.
Right.
Uh, about 5,000 African Americans fought in the rebel army, and it was the most integrated army until 1948 that America ever had, because they one unit um, was all black, but other than that, people's neighbors were, fighting alongside each other. The Indian story is a tragic story because Indians also faced that choice, which these white people were weirdly fighting with each other. And the question was, what would be best for your people? And they divided too, and no one was rewarded. No Indians were rewarded for any of their service on either side. They're not even mentioned in the treaty,
Yeah.
which is a truly shameful fact.
Well, the book starts with the French Indian War, and I was really struck with it beginning with a general for the British who was very powerfully fighting for British imperial interests, and in that war, in fact, played a role in starting the war, whose name was, of course, George Washington. And it's like, oh wow,
Yeah.
that I didn't,
He
see that
started a
coming.
global war
Yeah.
by firing on some French people in a clearing in near the Ohio River.
At one point, I know the British tried to put a ban on any territorial
Right.
concessions on the other side of the mountains, right? We have a
Of the
question actually from Jeffrey
right.
from Carla asked if the British had won, would they have ever honored that territorial concession to the native tribes?
I don't think they were very interested in spreading inland. Uh, their thing was profits and trade and so on. And I don't think if they'd stayed, they would somehow have uh, peopled the rest of the country, the rest of the continent. I think they wanted to stay over there.
Hmm.
For one, you could control the colonists better if they were hemmed in by the sea and the mountains. Um, that was one of the many surprises for me. I had not realized. I should explain a little bit. I was the editor of American Heritage a lifetime ago, and I knew almost nothing about colonial history or revolutionary history. And our subscribers expected an article from that period in each issue, which so when we had editorial meetings, we would say, "What's our short pants history for this month?" Which shows you the sort of dismissive attitude we had toward that. And one of the surprises to me is when I started reading is how incredibly interesting this whole period is. I mean, it's it's uh, it's fascinating, and it I learned so much stuff. It's hard to even express it all. I learned how incredibly bloody it was. It was a awful, awful, awful um, thing, particularly as a civil war, particularly in the South, where people, brothers murdered each other, and families were divided, and towns were divided, and it it uh, it we were born in blood. That's really true. And one of the things it makes you do, if you're me anyway, and if your family had been here a while, I got interested in how my family had dealt with it because I began to wonder which side I would have been on.
Yeah.
So I look back, and I have two ancestors that I know were involved. One of them was a wonderfully named continental general named Epaphroditus Champion. who,
Wow.
who exactly, who drove 300 cattle from Connecticut to Valley Forge to feed the soldiers there. But I'm also descended from somebody named Lieutenant John Ward, who the minute the shooting started joined a Tory outfit,
Hmm.
fought all through the war, and ended up living in New Brunswick in Canada. And it just made me think again, I don't know which would I have gone with Epaphroditus or would I have gone with Lieutenant Ward? I'm not sure.
And there were divisions within families as well, right?
You bet. No, no, it's our first Civil War. It's very like the second one. You know, uh, uh, it's incredibly bloody and bitter, and and I it's a wonder it ended. It
Yeah.
was so grim, especially toward the end, especially in the South where they people were poor and sort of angrier than people in the North. I don't know how else to put that.
You mentioned learning a lot in the process of writing this. I was wondering if there was anything particular that was surprising to you more than anything that you learned that you just didn't
Oh,
expect.
well, you brought up some of them. One of them is just I didn't realize how the struggle for Indian land
Mm,
motivated things. I mean, if you were a soldier, you were promised a certain number of acres after the war of Indian land, which they were quite prepared to hand over to you. No one consulted the Indians about any of that. I mean, it is that was just, there are a lot of things that surprised me. I was surprised that I always knew the French were in the war. I didn't know that they probably won the Battle of Yorktown, which they entirely planned, and which was a sort of pseudo siege, like a European uh, uh, battle. Um, I mean, I knew that they financed things, and I knew they sent soldiers, but I didn't really have any idea how how important they were to our success.
mm.
Um,
We have a question from Maxwell who asks, how do you think the long time it took to communicate with England impacted the war?
oh, it impacted everything. I mean, it was all very well to make a decision in London in June, but it didn't get to Boston or Pennsylvania till August. So instantaneous, you know, we think of these things that are immediate, and they are not. The British also did not understand how large the American colonies were, and so that their decisions too took forever. You know, you make a decision in New York, which was the sort of center of the British power, and people in Savannah got it weeks later, and it made it very hard to plan campaigns. And
Yeah, because conditions could have changed by the time the
yeah, sure.
message got. Yeah, really interesting. I wanted to ask a little bit about your process because you've done, two remarkable things. One, write this script for a 12-hour documentary, but also this incredible tome at the same time. And I was just wondering, like, how does that work? I mean, did you write
I
the
wrote the script
script
first.
first? You
Yeah,
did. Okay.
yeah.
And then is
And
this the stuff that
everything
didn't make it
everything
and
that,
everything else?
that we used to say ended up on the cutting room floor. Of course,
Yeah.
there's no cutting room floor anymore, but somewhere in the lurking in the computer was a lot of stuff that in the end you can't really do in the film. And I got to expand. That's why I love doing these books, because
Yeah.
you get to master this, you know, get the story once, and then expand all the things you wish you could have done in the to make it a 24-hour film, which probably isn't a good idea. Um, Plus, in the book, it has about 500 and something illustrations in it, which allowed me. I love to write about pictures. That's what American Heritage was famous for, and I love doing it. And um, that's as good a collection of art from that period and 19th century art about that period. I don't think there's a book that has more of it. And I
Mm.
tried to explain what was accurate and what was not in the important stuff. And it was great, great fun to do.
We have a question from one of the viewers asking how long it takes you to write one of your books.
It's hard. Ken Burns always says it took us 10 years to do everything, which if that were true, we'd be about 200 years old. So I am old, but I'm not that old. Um, I guess it took 2 years to do it, probably. After I write the script and then I work with everybody to change things and adapt stuff and cut and paste and add and so on. But there's a point at which I'm not needed every minute. And that's when I turn to the book. And I love doing it. I eat it up. I'm always sorry when there isn't a book with a series because I'd like to do another one.
Is the writing process, the way you write for TV is different than the way you would write for a book. And yet at the same time, the way these documentaries are written is not like any other TV writing that I can imagine. I'm just wondering, what it's
Not that
like
dif-
for you.
it's really not that different.
Yeah.
I am blessed when working with Ken. He likes words.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anybody heard him talk knows he likes words,
Yeah.
and so do I. And I write long. Um, I never, uh, I never, I got into this backwards. So I never sort of studied with anybody who told me I had to write short sentences and so on. So I don't. I write long ones. And we've had very good narrators who can read them. Peter Coyote, who's been the narrator for the last 3 or 4 films, is a wonder. Uh, we hand him the script. He looks at it and reads it as if he'd written it. It's just astonishing how he does it. And he's
Yeah.
a very good actor who knows not to be an actor when you're doing it, to be a storyteller.
Right.
And he tells he it just flows out of him. And my writing it there's more of it in the books, but I don't think there's very much difference. In the film, in the end, you don't have to have a topic sentence because the picture's the topic sentence.
Yeah.
That's sort of true, but that isn't even always true. And Ken doesn't, I don't write the kind of script, um, the kind I've seen in textbooks about writing films because I'm interested to see what they do, where there's a picture and the words are next to each other in a column so that you can. And I don't do any of that. I just write, I tell the story. And if I know about a picture, I put a footnote in saying, don't forget there's a great picture of Lyndon Johnson doing
Mhm.
X. Don't use the young Washington. Use the older one. That kind of thing. But
Right.
I don't do very much of that, and mostly I just try to tell the story.
One question from it says MD. It says the letter writers in the show were very eloquent, including the young girl. Were they specially selected? And I'm sure that a lot went into the choices of those letters.
Well, the girl is a girl. She was a woman by the time she wrote them,
Mm.
called Betsy Ambler, and she's another marvelous discovery. She lived in Yorktown to begin with, which was a great moment when we realized that. And uh, she's her father was a royal official, a customs collector, who switched to and became an official in the rebel Virginia government. But she is marvelous in just describing what it was like to be a refugee. Um, they were driven from their homes. Uh, she had a mother who was ill, and therefore they had to sort of be especially careful about her. And twice they had to really flee the British on back roads, hoping they wouldn't be captured by the redcoats. Uh, and her sister married John Marshall, who was the first uh, uh, Supreme Court head of chief
Oh, that Marshall. Yeah.
of the Supreme Court.
Yes.
So that was a nice bonus. That's like George Washington's tooth. We didn't know that at the beginning. I didn't know that.
That's amazing how these stories sort of take place over time. It's sort of incredible. Um, one person would like to know the difference between a loyalist and a Tory.
There isn't one,
Same thing.
except no, except loyalist is a Tory is pejorative. That's what the rebels called loyalists.
Okay. I mistakenly thought that a loyalist was anybody who sided with the British, whereas a Tory was particularly a soldier, someone who fought for the British.
No,
But that's not,
no,
a
no. It's
Tory was anybody who sided
yeah.
with.
It was almost a curse word.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Karen asks if you can talk about how the South was divided. Was it class, race, or other issues that divided patriots versus loyalists in the South?
I don't think so. I think it just depended on your family's feelings. Uh, there was religious hostility to the established Anglican Church.
Mhm.
The wealthy tended to be Anglicans, and uh, backwoods Baptists and so on uh, had long had. I mean, there was a lot of rich versus poor in the South. Um, and and black people again were on both sides of it. Um, I, I I don't know that there's that much difference.
And yet you talk about how, the if there's one side that is fully committed to slavery, it's the patriots, whereas the British were, sort of they offered freedom in some cases.
Yeah,
Um,
but they're offering freedom purely for logistical reasons.
right.
Their that's another thing I did not know until we got into this, which is that we think of ourselves as by far the most valuable and precious colonies. Actually, it was the Caribbean islands made,
Right.
and they were entirely run, not run, entirely worked by enslaved people, many, many more than ever came here. And so, I mean, there isn't it's not abolitionists versus enslavers. It's tactical stuff on both sides. Washington initially didn't think they should have any black people in the Continental Army, and then when they needed men, as has happened at every war since, they decided, oh yeah, we'll let them be in too.
I want to jump right back in with questions here. We have a lot of great questions.
Hey,
Yeah, please,
can
Jeffrey,
I say just one thing about PBS?
please.
I have been supernaturally lucky that for 45 years, I guess, I've been doing this. And what is astonishing to me is that I think I've done 27 shows, and God knows how many hours that is, because Ken won't stop, as you know. It's my fault, largely. Um,
I hope he doesn't.
I have never, ever had any conversation in which somebody said, you can't talk about that, or let's not do that because it'll upset somebody. Uh, we do complicated history. If you really, I think I can say, if you really want to know a pretty good straight account of American history, Ken is your man. And we've been doing it a long time. He has a sign in his editing room. It's a little neon sign, and it says it's complicated.
Mm,
And it's true. Every story we've ever done is more complicated than we thought it was ever going to be when we start. And just untangling Vietnam, for instance, which we did some years ago, or finding the real reasons for prohibition, which we did years ago.
mm.
I don't think anybody else other than Ken and other than PBS would ever think to do that. And if you watch history TV, and I don't mean to knock anybody, but most history TV is really simple-minded,
It's boiled down.
and it's heroes and villains,
Yeah.
and the villains are all bad guys, and the heroes are all flawless. And that's not how life is or history was.
When you mentioned the heroes and bad guys, it brings to mind one character in your book and in your movie, who I think throughout history has been simplified, really oversimplified, as the most notorious turncoat of his all, and his to the point that his name means turncoat, right?
Right.
Benedict Arnold. And reading about him and watching the documentaries, like there's so much more to
Oh, he's
Benedict Arnold's story than I ever
fantastic.
appreciated. Can you
I
talk a little bit
agree.
about him?
Sure. He was probably the best soldier in the Continental Army.
Yeah.
He was a fantastically brave, very smart, tactically sharp fella with terrible flaws about himself. He was very thin-skinned and very consumed with himself. And at some point, he decides that he's not at all sure that this can be a victory. He doesn't like, I mean, his motives are very complicated.
Mm,
He's hoping to get paid a lot of money by the British to come over to their side. He also wrote a long explanation of why he did it, and he said he went to war to restore the way British rule had been, and this independence business was not anything
yeah.
he planned to take part in. Now, he also made a lot of money. Uh, he was, and I'm glad you mentioned him because he's interesting in the book. If you look at the paintings of 19th century paintings of great events, like the taking of Fort Ticonderoga before the shooting started, or uh, or the final battle of Saratoga, in which a whole British army was captured. He was instrumental in those things, and the supposedly historical paintings of of the surrender at Saratoga, painted by John Trumbull, an American patriotic American. He's not in the painting. There are like 30 generals there, none of whom had any role, anything like his. He's not there at all. There's a painting at the beginning of the book, a 19th century painting of the taking of Fort Ticonderoga, which was led by him and Ethan Allen. And in the painting, Ethan Allen is banging on the British barracks door with a little boy behind him instead of the person who was actually there. So it's it's that kind of black and white, good and bad, that
Yeah.
I love making it more complicated than that because it always is.
Yeah. We have a question about the role of women in the revolution, and I know that is something also that you really address in both the movie and the book is the important. I mean, it's not just Abigail Adams. I feel like that's the one name we
Yeah.
hear about. You
Yeah.
talk about a lot of these important
Well,
stories.
yes, the Betsy Ambler that I talked about before. Another thing I learned was I didn't realize that in the 18th century, armies, whether they were British or American or French for that matter, had large numbers of women who marched with them. I mean, hundreds of women, and they weren't all. There's a sort of euphemism, camp followers, and you're supposed to think that they're not not flawless.
Mhm.
But what they were largely was the wives of the very poor soldiers. Most of the Continental soldiers were very poor, um, who literally either they wanted to stay with their husband no matter what, or could not possibly survive without staying with the army. And they served all sorts of tasks. They nursed people, they fed them, they washed their clothes, they sold things. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And I had never understood that at all. Um, they also, before the war, when the Patriots were uh, trying to encourage local production of things and boycotting British products, it was the women who really did that. They
Yeah.
ran households. And it's all very well for you and me down at the tavern to say, we really shouldn't buy whatever it is that we're not supposed to buy. They decided that they weren't going to have that in their house.
Yeah.
So to me, that's another fascinating part of this war that I didn't know anything about when I started.
Hmm. We have a question from one of the viewers asking, besides Greenwood, who do you think are the top two most unacknowledged or unrecognized and unappreciated heroes of the Revolutionary War?
Oh goodness, that's a really hard one.
That's a tough one, right?
Because if you don't know them, I mean, I'm sure there are many unsung people, and they're unsung. So I can't name any of them. Um, I, I didn't quite see Greenwood as that. I just saw him as a picturesque adventurer of a kind you don't often run across, and who wrote well.
Yeah.
That the reason we know about him is that he wrote marvelously, and he was very ironic and funny about this awful stuff that he went through.
Yeah. We have a great question from Linda who wants something a little more personal, asks about your pathway to get to this place in your career. And I might add, if there are advice that you might offer people about, you've had a lot of success in your career. You've done some incredible things. If you could just share a little bit of your own story.
Sure. I started out to be a painter. I went to Oberlin College. I thought I was going to be a painter. Then I wasn't. And I became an editor and a picture editor and so on, and eventually got to be at American Heritage, where I worked for a while and loved it. And then I got canned. A story we won't possibly do now. Nothing bad that I did. And uh, some Ken called that office. It said, did they know anybody there that could come take a look at his film that he was working on, because he had an NEH grant and he needed one more warm body to look at the film and officially say something about it. So I flew up to Walpole. I said, sure. I had nothing else to do. And I went up there, and he was doing his lovely film on the Shakers. I had three or four suggestions, none of which he paid the slightest attention to, but we liked each other. And on the way to the airport to get me back to New York, he said, have you ever thought of writing a film? And I said, well, I've always loved documentaries, but I've never done it. And
Mm.
so I wrote Huey Long, which was the first one I did for him. And
Wow.
uh, that got in the New York Film Festival, which and he called with great excitement to tell me this. I live in New York. I thought, okay, well, it's a New York film. If you're in New York, you get in the New York Film Festival.
Yeah.
I, I don't think we've ever been in it again, but and then we just started working together. We enjoy each other's company, and it's not a very there's no real advice in there, I'm afraid. It's If that phone call hadn't happened, God knows what I would have done. I would have written books, I guess. But I've been very, very lucky, and I've loved doing it. I mean, to be able to do so many different, really interesting topics, but not spend your whole life on them.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. It's been a lot of fun, and continues to be.
The advice I take from that is to jump at opportunities as they present
Well,
themselves.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have a question here from Jamie who says, don't you think Nathaniel Green doesn't get enough recognition?
Uh, if if you want a soldier that doesn't get enough recognition, he is it.
Yeah.
She's absolutely right. And it's, first of all, evidence of George Washington's astonishing ability to pick people. Uh, Green was a Quaker who decided that pacifism was impractical, and we should all be grateful that he that he did that. Um, and when the people were starving at Valley Forge and there were no supplies, he turned to him He didn't want to do that dull job. He wanted to be a battle commander, but he did it beautifully, and he collected stuff and kept that army eating. And then he went south and fought a whole series of battles, uh, lost almost all of them, and destroyed the British Army in the South. I mean, he was just very he was a very practical person. For me, he reminds me of U.S. Grant, who didn't have any particular panache about him. He wasn't dashing. He wasn't interested in any of that. He understood that war is slogging, and he slogged and he won. So she's dead right.
Yeah.
He's the great unsung general.
Okay. All right. Great question. Thank you for that. You know, I was thinking about this also, that I think if you ask most people what the revolution was about, and the primary goal of it, they would say the desire for democracy. But it wasn't actually about that at first, right? One of the
No,
historians in the documentary says, and I wrote down the quote here because I thought it was really striking. Democracy is not the aspiration that creates the revolution. The revolution creates the conditions for people to aspire to have a democracy. Can you
but
speak about that? I think
well, you just
it
said it.
inverts this whole thing
I
for
think
me.
that's exactly right. I mean, that war started for two reasons, I guess. I mean, there are many bits and pieces of it. One is the Indian lands business,
Yeah.
and the other is Britain began to try to tighten the screws because it was desperate to pay for the French and Indian War. And people here didn't want to pay those taxes. They didn't think, since they didn't have a vote in Parliament, and they for a long time, Parliament was the enemy, not the king, not the system. It's just that Parliament was acting wrong. And it was, in some ways, it was a conservative revolution. It was fought by a lot of people who wanted to get back to how things were in 1753 and 54. And uh, that's very hard to sort of grasp, but it's true. And then it became more and more a people's event. Um, and a lot of the founding fathers took a very dim view of democracy, as in the sense that if you didn't have people weren't propertied, they really had no reason to vote, and so on. So it's a process. It was a long process, and it and declaring that all men are created equal is the line that made it happen. I mean, after a while, that's a self-evident, or should be a self-evident thing. We haven't got there yet, but
Yeah, and when they said that, they meant a very small section
yes,
of the people in this country, right? They
all
did, first of all, when they said all men, they meant men, but they also
you
meant men with land.
and they also
It
meant
didn't,
white men.
and it meant white men. That's what
Yep.
was the most
Oh, that's
important.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. So that definition gets broader and broader and broader. And
And
one of the things I found funny, it's in the film and in the book, is the British reaction to that, which is just it sounded like complete madness to them, or to some of them. How what and as one man says, every plowman knows that's not true, you know, and they're not hearing it the way it was meant. But it's interesting how the words play in different places.
yeah. 3 weeks from today, kids in Boston, including my own son, have the day off from school, not for St. Patrick's Day, but it's evacuation day, when the British fled from Boston Harbor. And in your telling of it, the achievement that led to that of Henry Knox dragging this heavy artillery that made it all possible, all the way from Fort Ticonderoga. It just sounds like one of the most remarkable achievements, and almost seemingly impossible achievements
Yeah,
in
yeah.
American history.
And that's another case of Washington's extraordinary ability to pluck people out of the soldiers. Henry Knox was an overweight uh, bookstore owner who had studied artillery for the militia company. That's it. And he was sent all the way to Ticonderoga and organized all the ox train to haul tons and tons of artillery down, which the British never imagined would appear.
Mm.
And then Washington's army very quickly put it up on those hills. And the British realized overnight they did that and realized when they woke up in the morning, wait a minute, we're about to be blown to bits. And off they went to New York. Well, first to Canada and then to New York.
Hmm.
It's
It's just,
an astonishing achievement.
it really is. It
It
really
is.
is to think about today. Um, Unbelievable. David asks, did the colonies and or slash states differ a lot in the proportion of men who fought for the rebel cause?
Yeah. I'm not very good on that, but I know that the smaller states were only expected to provide a certain number of continental soldiers, and the larger states were requested anyway to provide much larger numbers.
Okay.
So Delaware was quite small,
Right.
that kind of thing.
Yeah. Linda from Uxbridge asks, what did you learn during the research and filming that was the most disappointing?
Disappointing. Boy, I don't know that I was disappointed. I tried. I can't think of anything. I mean, I've I guess I was sorry it was so bloody, but that's not quite the same thing as being
Yeah.
disappointed. I mean, it is after a while as you read about it, you just realize, oh my God, they're gonna lynch each other again, and they're gonna burn their houses, and they're gonna rape their wives, and I mean, all of that went on, and it's I have a standard thing that I try to say. I will do it again. I don't think history repeats itself. And I don't know if Mark Twain ever said it chimes, but he should have if he didn't.
Mm.
And um, in my argument with people who get upset if you talk about the flaws of historical personages, George Washington owned a lot of slaves. He also liberated the country. You, you shouldn't mention the slaves, you know. Um, that seems to me not to be history at all. And it also, I think, is very uh, weakening, sort of. Um,
Mm.
Historical people, just like us, do not know what's going to happen on Tuesday.
Right.
And they didn't know how the war was going to be fought. They didn't know if they were going to win. Um, and they were all flawed, just the way we're flawed.
Yeah.
And if you believe they're without flaw and we are horribly flawed in some way, then we can't ever do anything. But they were full of weaknesses and did terrible things, some of them. But they also did great things. And I just think it's important to understand the reality of history and biography, because otherwise it makes you feel powerless. You just say, oh, look, he wore a toga and he, had a white wig and he was flawless and he was eloquent and all those things may be true, but he was also whoever he is or she is, was also sometimes venal and sometimes cowardly and sometimes stupid, just the way we are. So
I mean,
that's
as we celebrate the 250th anniversary of this revolution, certainly not in the work that you've done here in the book and in the documentary, um, are you sensing, are you feeling that there's a whitewashing of American history that happens to make it more palatable for people here?
yeah. I mean, the history I taught when I was a kid was whitewashed.
Yeah.
I think we're on a swing where we're going back to the whitewashing. I hope we are counter a counter thrust for that, not because anybody wants to check boxes or be woke in some dumb definition of that word, but because um, history is by definition inclusive. It happens to everybody. Everybody does it, and we need to keep that in mind, I think.
Yeah. We have a question from Mark in Waltham who said he'd be truly grateful to know the top two facts you would like all students of the American Revolution to know about the history you told so successfully for the audience here. What two things should people really know?
Everybody was involved in the revolution. It's one thing. There is no group that wasn't involved in one way or another. What's another one? I think what I said before. I think it's it. The revolution was fought and won by ordinary people, and ordinary people can do great things. That's proof of it.
Yeah. Gloria asks about Dr. Joseph Warren, who's someone we haven't really touched on in the couple minutes we have left. Can you tell us a little bit about his story?
Well, yeah, he was a terribly important Massachusetts patriot, and he insisted on, and he was pretty close to a selfless person. I have to say, having said that no one is, he was pretty close. And when Bunker Hill happened, he felt obligated to go fight with his compatriots, and he was killed. And the British made a great obscene fuss about uh, burying him as a sort of vermin. Um, he was a target of great anger by the British.
I think that's unfortunately we've run out of time. This has been just an absolute
Fun. Yeah.
joy to talk to you, to hear about this incredible project. Is there anything that you would like to just to wrap up with? Anything that you when we look back 250 years now from the American Revolution that you'd like to leave our audience with?
They did great things, and we can too.
There it is. There it is. We can do it too. Geoffrey, thank you so much for
Thank
joining us. This
you.
has been just such an
It
absolute
was fun.
joy. Thank you for joining us. This has been a real pleasure, and the work that you've done on this book and this documentary are truly remarkable. And thanks for speaking with us about it.
Thanks a lot. It was
And to
fun.
everybody out there, thank you for joining us, and have just a great night.